because prior to 2005, something called consumer culture theory didn't really exist. Before that, I would have called myself an interpretive consumer researcher. But I suppose the key thing here is, oh, and by the way, we're recording the presentation as we move forward. So long as you don't have any objection to that, I'll keep going. But yeah, so we're interested in consumption. We're interested in consumers. We're interested in how people choose, buy, use, and dispose of stuff, I suppose. But we're different from the traditional consumer behavior approach in that we're more interested in culture rather than what goes on inside, principally inside the consumer's mind. So we're much broader, or certainly very different from consumer behavior, and you may have done consumer behavior in a past life at some kind of level. But we're still interested primarily in the same kinds of things. I guess I must explain my slides as well. I have robots on all my slides, and the reason for the robots really is because consumer culture theory lies in contrast with the traditional information processing model of understanding the consumer. So what you get in consumer behavior is a focus on consumption decision making. So how do we as consumers, how do we as people make decisions about products and services? How do we decide between brand A and brand B, and so on and so forth? And the focus very much within consumer behavior is on the purchase process, and the focus is very much on how we make decisions in that purchase process. In consumer culture theory, though, we go well beyond the purchase process itself, and we're really not interested in what happens inside the mind of the consumer. So we don't ascribe to this idea that consumers are logical information processors. So within consumer behavior, consumers collect information, process that information, and act on that information ultimately. So almost like robots. In consumer culture theory, we look outside of the consumer for explanations for why we do the kinds of things we do, and so on. And I guess it's fair to say that our understanding of consumption and consumer behavior emerges from work by Holbrook and Hirschman in 1982, who suggest that rather than this kind of logical decision making, consumers are much more emotional beings. They're much more embodied beings, so our bodies influence the kinds of things we do and the kinds of consumption patterns we engage in. And we're much more symbolic beings in that we're interested not just in the functions of stuff, what products and services do for us, but we're also primarily interested in what stuff means, what it says about us as people. And I suppose that connects to this age-old idea that we are what we consume. What we're interested in as consumer culture theorists is not just the purchase process, but what we might call the circle of consumption or the cycle of consumption that involves acquisition, consumption, and disposal. So how we get our hands on stuff, how we use that stuff, and ultimately how we get rid of that stuff. And all the while being interested in the meanings that are attached to stuff, the value we place on stuff, and so forth. And I'm using stuff as a very, very technical term here, of course. When we talk about behavior, when we talk about consumer patterns, we're interested in the behavior and patterns of individuals and of groups. So not just individual consumers, but looking at individual consumers, but also looking at consumers as part of wider social groups, both formal and informal groups. And we're interested in the consumption of products, services, ideas, and experiences. So not just your typical products and services that we tend to think about in marketing and consumer behavior. And when we think about acquisition, consumption, and disposal, there's a whole range of activities we're interested in rather than just purchase. So finding stuff, inheriting stuff, collecting stuff, recycling stuff, all of these different processes become key areas of consideration for us in consumer culture theory. What consumer culture theory has done primarily since 2005 is it has advanced our understanding of the consumer by illuminating socio-cultural processes and structure related to three major things. So we're interested in the relationship between consumer actions, what we do as consumers, what we do as human beings. And we're interested in the relationship between those actions and the marketplace. So how does the marketplace, how do marketers, individual marketing organizations, and the marketing industry as a whole, how do those things influence the actions that we take, the behaviors we engage in, the patterns of consumption we subscribe to? But also we're interested then in cultural meaning. So how does, I suppose an interesting question is, how does the marketplace borrow, adopt meanings from culture, attach those meanings to consumer goods or to services and so on, in order to make us want those things, in order to make us desire those things and so forth. A very simple example might be Guinness. And Guinness campaigns of old would have talked about good things come to those who wait. That idea of waiting is actually a cultural disposition in Ireland. We're born to wait in Ireland. We have to wait. Things don't come easily. So Guinness take this cultural meaning and they attach it to their products that also connect to the nature of the product because of the way Guinness is poured. And all of these things then begin to mean something to consumers about Irishness, about being Irish and so on, about identity. And therefore, Guinness becomes more than just an alcoholic drink. And when we look at consumer culture theory, there are 4 broad research streams that we can engage in. I suppose the prime concern of consumer culture theory is identity of one shape or another. So we're very interested in this idea of you are what you consume. So the idea that the things that we consume, the products, services, ideas, and experiences reflect who we are. And not only reflect who we are, but also we can use them to communicate a sense of self to others. So at the individual level, consumer culture theorists are interested in what we call consumer identity projects. So how we use stuff to say things about ourselves as individuals, to say things about ourselves as people in the world. We're also interested, however, in what we call marketplace cultures, which is the more social groups, the wider groups in society that we as individuals are members of. Because we're not just individuals, we're members of formal and informal groups in society. What we like to call subcultures of consumption, brand communities, or even neo-tribes. So various kinds of cultures, various kinds of groups in society that are also influenced by or connected to our consumption. So we might be Harley Davidson owners or Saab owners and so on, and be involved with other people who consume the same brands. The third research stream we call the socio-historic patterning of consumption. And that relates to how things like gender, social class, ethnicity, and even things like age and so on, how these things influence our access to consumption and our ability to play the game of consumption, because unfortunately it's not a level playing field, and our access to these things is determined in major ways by finance particularly, but also by who we are as people in terms of gender, age, and so on. And the final research stream is a bit of a mouthful. It's marketplace ideologies and consumers' interpretive strategies. And what we're interested in here is principally the process of marketing communication, how organizations speak to us. And they don't just speak to us about their products. They also speak to us about how their products fit into particular lifestyles, fit into the world. And they also speak to us about how we should live our lives, what it means to be masculine, for example, what it means to be feminine. So these are ideologies that reside in the marketplace that try and teach us how to live our lives and how consumption should fit into those lives. So we're interested in how marketers speak to us, but we're also interested in how consumers, how we as human beings deal with all of that information. How do we cope with the messages that we're exposed to? How do we cope with the ideologies that are that we're confronted with on an almost daily basis? So what I'd kind of like to do just for the next couple of minutes is talk to you about some of the research areas that I've specifically been working in. And I've narrowed it down to 3. I've been involved in lots of different kinds of things, but there's kind of, at the moment at least, there's 3 main areas of research that I'm interested in. The first of which we might call embodiment and consumption. So I have a keen interest in the body, in our bodies, in all of our bodies and so forth. So this theme centers on the relationship between consumption, embodiment, and identity. So I'm interested in this connection between our bodies, our sense of self, and the kinds of things we therefore consume. So to give you an example of some of those research projects that I've been involved in, then I've done some work on, for example, the representation of masculine bodies in advertising. So what is masculinity? How do we understand masculinity in contemporary society? And how do advertisers mobilize this idea of masculinity by using bodies in advertising? And I've done the same for femininity and feminine bodies and so on and so forth. So this is about how marketers communicate to us. I've done a lot of research on tattoo consumption and particularly interested in a couple of things, I suppose. One, the meanings of tattoos, because if you've ever watched any of these tattoo programs on TV, for example, it's all about the meanings. I got this tattoo because my grandmother died or whatever it might be, and so it's a memorial tattoo. But more than that, I'm interested in what tattoos say about us as human beings. And that's less focused on the meanings of tattoos and the functions that we put tattoos to, I suppose. So we can think about tattoos, and particularly tattoos on the skin, as representing to some degree at least the relationship between the me inside and the world outside, because at some level at least our tattoos communicate to other people. They also tell us, of course, that our bodies are never finished, that our bodies are essentially objects to be modified over time. And we don't just use tattoos for that. We use plastic surgery. We use everyday products and so forth to modify our bodies over time. So there's a whole host of issues that are wrapped up in that. I've also been involved in some research around male models in the fashion industry, and how male models, how they use their bodies in the catwalk and so on and so forth to communicate to audiences about what is fashionable and so on, but also to make audiences feel something about clothes. The second research stream, and this is the one I'm kind of heavily involved in at the moment, is around sound. And here I'm trying to tease out the potential impact of what we call the turn to sound in an intellectual context that remains relatively silent, by addressing the question, what does it mean to listen to consumption? So consumer culture theory and consumer behavior before it have primarily been interested in the visual, in how we represent things visually, how we consume the world through our eyes and so forth. I'm kind of more interested at the moment in what the world sounds like. And I'm interested not just in the consumption of sounds, so how we consume sound, but I'm also interested in trying to understand consumption better by approaching it through sound, almost as a lens, I suppose. And I've done some work on autonomous sensory meridian response, also called ASMR. I don't know if you've ever come across ASMR. They're also called whisper videos on YouTube and so on. And these videos are designed to make us feel good. They're designed to have an effect on the body. So it's not about what these sounds mean, but it's actually about the functional use of these sounds to help us sleep, to make us feel less anxious, and so on. And so everyday sounds are turned into objects of consumption. And I've also done some work on New Orleans and how the sounds of Bourbon Street in New Orleans in particular encourage us to engage with the place in very particular ways. So we're encouraged to be shoppers, we're encouraged to be tourists, we're encouraged to be music fans at different points in time, at the same time, primarily through the sonic landscape of the streets of New Orleans. So the streets speak to us, they call to us to be certain kinds of people, certain kinds of consumers. And the final research stream that I'm involved in is essentially around placemaking, about places, about place brands, about tourism destinations, and so on. So we might suggest, for example, that places are not static or objective phenomena, they actually represent specific historical and cultural phases in society and are better understood as social contexts. They're not just physical, but they're fluid, changeable, dynamic contexts of social interaction, shared cultural meaning, collective memory, and so on. And again, I've been involved in some work on Santorini in Greece, in Falaraki in Greece, but much more recently, we're doing some work on the Wild Atlantic Way in Ireland. And what's interesting about the Wild Atlantic Way is that it's almost an accidental strategy to call the really bad roads on the west of Ireland, to call them a drive tourism product, and to call it the Wild Atlantic Way. It speaks to us then of wild and the wilderness, and it speaks to us about different kinds of meanings or understandings of the wild. So the wilderness and ideas of wild are kind of mythical. Every culture has this idea of the wild, but we might understand it differently, for example. So Americans tend to understand the wild as a kind of a frontier space that has to be conquered or challenged or whatever it might be. Other ideas of the wild are about escape. So we escape to the wilderness to get away from everyday city living and so forth. I think in Ireland, the wild primarily represents the untamed, almost the uncivilized, or kind of irreverence, or failure to accept the rules sometimes. Things are not always going to go perfectly in Ireland. And particularly as a tourist, if you're coming into Ireland, things are not going to go as you might have planned, and even the weather doesn't play ball. But that's okay if we call this place the Wild Atlantic Way, because then people who consume it come to expect a degree of wildness about it. And so we see very much the places are not just about the landscape, about the physical features of a place, but also about the meanings we attach to those places, about the conversations we have about those places, and so on. Just briefly then, before I finish, just a couple of examples of the PhD projects that I've supervised in the past. So the most recent was about road bowling in Ireland, and if you've never come across road bowling, it's essentially throwing a cannonball up the middle of a country road, and it's a game, and it involves hundreds of people who are betting on this game, and so on and so forth. The project was about how we understand space and how we understand the road, for example. PhDs on tourism in Greece, on brand visuals, so the Orla Kiley brand and how the Orla Kiley brand mobilized the STEM design and how consumers understand that STEM design and how they use it and so forth. High-speed motorcycling as a practice, an embodied practice, how we learn to ride motorcycles and how motorcycles encourage us to ride them in particular ways and so on. So you can see from those PhDs that they're fairly wide-ranging, lots of different kinds of topics. And that's the thing about consumer culture theory, I suppose, and about our interest in supervising projects in consumer culture theory, is that as long as it feeds into processes of acquisition, use, and disposal, as long as it's about culture, consumer culture and meanings and so forth, then we're interested in supervising. So it allows you a lot of scope in terms of choosing research topics. Okay, so that's basically the presentation. Any questions?
Thanks very much, Maurice. That was really interesting, and I think it shows the potential, you know, diversity and novelty and innovation that can go into these kind of research areas that, you know, that they could be driven as much by presumably student interests in an area, personal attachment.
We talk about how we end up in jobs and so forth. So I've ended up as a lecturer in marketing, but primarily doing research in consumer culture theory, almost by accident. I've fallen into this area because the things I wanted to research, the things I wanted to look into, were just things I was doing in my everyday life. So it's driven by personal interest in the kinds of lives we lead, the kinds of things we do for extracurricular activities or whatever it might be. So the tattoo research that I do was driven primarily because I'm covered in the bloody things. I've spent a hell of a lot of money and a hell of a lot of time and endured a hell of a lot of pain in order to be tattooed. And I couldn't make sense of it in a logical way. So it was about understanding those processes, I suppose, from a different perspective.
And equally the student topics, and I'm aware of some of them myself quite well, from obviously our conversations over the years. They've been equally driven by students' maybe deep attachment to something in their lives, or meaning that their consumption gives them, and they want to explore that as part of a PhD study. Isn't that right? Yes.
And I think I think particularly in consumer culture theory, it's always a good idea to start with the personal. So if something is really important to you, then that's always worth pursuing in terms of a research project, a research idea, and so forth.
Sure. Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Maurice. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question maybe, or make an observation? We have somebody in the comments talking about the Wild Atlantic Way. I don't know if you can see that, Maurice. Alluding to your conversation there earlier.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the Wild Atlantic Way is that there was a decision made very quickly with the Wild Atlantic Way that they actually weren't going to invest in the infrastructure. So there's very, very little investment in the infrastructure overall. Now, there may be some improvement to roads and so on. But essentially, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the resources to invest heavily in the infrastructure. So calling it wild was interesting because it allowed the roads to be to not be so good sometimes. It allowed for the kinds of things that we might expect on the west coast of Ireland.
And has it been a very successful project, right?
So yeah. I mean, but the thing, what's also interesting about it is when you call something wild, it attracts some tourists, but it also keeps others away. And they have to manage it because one of the big problems with tourism is over-tourism, of course. And so we're trying to manage numbers and so on. So it is attracting tourists. It's not attracting. It doesn't seem to be attracting too many tourists. But also people don't tend to consume it as a whole. So people don't tend to do the Wild Atlantic Way from start to finish to 2,200 miles of coastline road or whatever it is. They tend to dip in and out of various places along the way.
Sure. Perfect. Very interesting. Helen, is there anything you wanted to maybe say to wrap up? I'm wondering how we're doing in terms of time.
We have about 4 minutes left. No, it was just a fantastic presentation.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. And Maurice, presumably just one last thing to say, if anybody is interested in making contact in this area, are you happy to maybe advice,
I'm absolutely happy to talk to anyone. I can meet anybody. We can talk about potential proposal drafting and all that kind of stuff. I'm absolutely delighted. At the moment, I don't have any PhD students that I'm supervising. I've kind of taken a small break after 7 in a row.
Sure.
But I'm kind of itching to get back on the horse, I suppose, in some.
Good for you.
Okay. So if anybody is interested, even in just talking, I mean, it doesn't have to be any kind of clearly formulated idea or whatever it might be, then please just do contact me on maurice.patterson@ul.ie, and I'm happy to talk further.
Super. Thank you so much, Maurice. That was really interesting and very stimulating. Appreciate your efforts. Thank you.